The Galactic Council chamber was a marvel of engineering, a vast, domed structure suspended in the void of space, illuminated by a pulsating aurora of artificial starlight. Representatives of dozens of species sat in hovering seats arranged in a semicircle. Their forms varied, some towering and insectoid, others compact and reptilian, a few nearly amorphous. At the center of it all stood Ambassador Ilvaris of the Xener Dominion, his elongated, crystalline form reflecting the chamber's cold light. "The matter before us is clear," Ilvaris said, his voice resonating in the room. "Humanity wishes to be recognized as a full member of this council, yet they remain an anomaly. Physically unimpressive, their technology lagging centuries behind our own, and worst of all, clumsy." There was a murmur of agreement among the assembled counselors. The Ralzek, a species of avian-like tacticians, clicked their beaks in unison. The Nzor, with their chitinous exoskeletons, exchanged glances through the vibrations of their antennae. It was no secret that humanity's admission had been met with skepticism. Seated at a modest podium near the center, Captain Elias Carter of the Terran Defense Initiative felt the weight of their disdain. He was the sole human in the room, clad in a crisp uniform that, despite his best efforts, seemed almost primitive compared to the flowing robes and bio-woven garments of the other species. His brown eyes remained steady as he listened, his posture rigid but not aggressive. Ilvaris turned his faceted gaze toward Carter. "Your species relies on crude projectile weapons. Your battle strategies are erratic at best, and I have personally witnessed human diplomats struggle to navigate low-gravity environments without flailing embarrassingly. Why should we place any confidence in your abilities?" Carter exhaled slowly, controlling his irritation. The council's disdain was expected, but the sheer arrogance grated on him. He leaned slightly forward, his voice calm yet firm. "With all due respect, Ambassador, we do not measure our worth by the smoothness of our stride in alien corridors," Carter said. "Nor do we expect you to judge us by our limitations rather than our strengths." A ripple of amusement spread through the chamber. The Ralzek representative tilted her head. "And what precisely are these strengths?" Carter met her gaze without hesitation. "Survival, adaptation, perseverance. You call our weapons crude, but they have shaped every battlefield we have fought on for millennia. You call us erratic, but unpredictability is an advantage, not a flaw." The murmurs grew louder, some curious, others dismissive. Ilvaris waved a translucent hand. "Charming rhetoric, but words do not win wars. The Zaldar Dominion is advancing, and the Council's forces are already stretched thin. If we must rely on you, what can you offer beyond stubbornness?" The mention of the Zaldar cast a shadow over the chamber. A warlike, expansionist species, they had begun a campaign of conquest across the outer colonies, their fleets systematically overwhelming one planet after another. Their dominance was built on strength, ruthless efficiency, and advanced energy weapons that rendered most conventional defenses obsolete. Carter remained composed. "If you truly believe humans have nothing to offer, then allow us to prove otherwise. Deploy us where your forces have failed. Let us face the Zaldar on our own terms." Laughter rippled through the chamber. The idea of humans, with their slow reflexes and outdated weaponry, holding the line against the Zaldar was absurd. "You would only be throwing away lives," the Ralzek counselor said dismissively. Ilvaris, however, regarded Carter with an unreadable expression. "Very well," he said at last. "A Zaldar force has taken Telvara Prime. Our fleets have been unable to break their hold. If humanity can retake the planet, you will have your place among us." A calculated decision. The Council did not expect the humans to succeed. They expected a humiliating defeat, an end to the argument. Carter stood, his expression betraying no emotion. "Then we will see who underestimates whom." As he turned to leave, he did not miss the smirks of the other representatives, nor the barely concealed amusement in Ilvaris's crystalline gaze. They had already written off humanity. They would learn. The descent onto Telvara Prime was silent. The transport ship, sleek but unremarkable, cut through the thin atmosphere like a ghost, its engines dampened to avoid detection. Inside, Captain Elias Carter sat motionless, his rifle laid across his lap, his breathing steady. Around him, 10 of Earth's finest marksmen mirrored his stillness, their bodies relaxed but their minds sharpened to a fine edge. The planet below had once been a thriving hub of interstellar commerce. Now, it was a graveyard. The sprawling cityscape had been reduced to blackened husks, its towering structures cracked and crumbling, its streets littered with debris and the remnants of failed resistance. The Zalthar had taken Telvara in days, overwhelming the planet's defenders with ruthless precision. Council forces had tried to retake it twice. Twice they had failed. Their energy weapons had been too slow to adjust to the Zalthar's adaptive shielding, their battle formations predictable, their reliance on technology a fatal flaw. The Zalthar had studied them, anticipated them, dismantled them. Carter knew they wouldn't be expecting humans. He tapped his earpiece. Check comms. A series of quiet acknowledgments followed, each voice measured, calm. They were more than soldiers. They were hunters. Every man and woman aboard had spent years mastering patience, wind calculations, the art of reading movement. They did not charge into battle. They became part of the landscape, unseen, untraceable, inevitable. The ship landed in the shadow of a skeletal building. No light, no sound, just the hiss of the landing ramp lowering. The snipers disembarked and vanished into the ruins, spreading like whispers through the shattered city. Within moments, they were gone. Carter took position in the remains of an old observation tower, the highest point in this sector. The structure swayed slightly in the wind, its metal frame weakened by time and war, but it would hold. He set up his rifle, adjusting the scope with practiced ease. Through it, the city unfolded, a wasteland of fire-scorched roads and gutted structures, with patrols of Zalthar warriors moving through the rubble. They were tall, encased in segmented armor that shimmered with an unnatural sheen. Their weapons pulsed with contained energy, lethal and silent. He exhaled. The hunt had begun. Miles away, Private Janessa Cole lay prone on the roof of a collapsed transport station, her rifle nestled against her shoulder. She tracked a Zalthar officer through her scope, watching the way he moved, confident, unhurried. He thought himself untouchable. They all did. She adjusted for wind. Breathed in. Breathed out. Squeezed the trigger. The shot was almost an afterthought, the sound suppressed, the bullet slicing through the air with lethal intent. A moment later, the officer collapsed, a neat hole punched through his helmet. The Zalthar around him froze. Cole was already gone. Across the city, it happened again. And again. High-ranking targets, field commanders, communication officers, each one falling before they could raise an alarm. The Zalthar, so used to crushing their enemies with brute force, suddenly found themselves paralyzed. Their enemies were not engaging. Their enemies were not visible. They were simply dying. Carter observed the growing panic through his scope. He could see the unease in their movements now, the slight hesitations, the nervous glances toward empty rooftops and dark alleyways. The council had called humans clumsy, predictable. He wondered what they would call them now. A crackle in his earpiece. "Captain," came Sergeant Malik's voice, low and controlled. "They're shifting patterns. Starting to move in tighter formations. They're trying to cut off our angles," Carter murmured. "Let them. They're still thinking in straight lines." He adjusted his sights, tracking a squad leader barking orders to his unit. A single shot silenced him mid-command. The squad scattered. The next hour was chaos. The Zalthar tried to regroup, to make sense of the enemy that refused to engage them directly. They fired wildly into buildings, blasted entire streets apart, but they were fighting shadows. The humans did not fire unless they had the shot. They did not move unless it was safe. Every bullet found a purpose. Then, the Zalthar adapted. Carter saw the shift almost immediately. The remaining commanders stopped relying on formation and began using unpredictable movement patterns, making it harder to track them. Snipers called in that their targets were beginning to double back, using drones to flush out potential hiding spots. The Zalthar were learning. Good. Carter activated his comm. Pull back to secondary positions. Time to change the rules. The snipers melted away into the ruins once more. The Zalthar, thinking they had finally driven their attackers away, hesitated. Then, cautiously, they advanced. Carter waited. Then, at his command, the next phase began. Explosions erupted across the city as carefully planted charges collapsed key structures, bottlenecking the Zaldar into kill zones. Those who tried to take cover in buildings found themselves trapped as sniper fire picked them off one by one. The panic returned, sharper this time, edged with something close to fear. The Zaldar did not fear. And yet, tonight they did. Carter's gaze lingered on the battlefield below. The Council had doubted them. The Zaldar had dismissed them. But war was not just about strength. It was about patience, precision. It was about knowing that victory was not given, but taken. Telvara Prime was far from won. But for the first time since the war had begun, the Zaldar were running. The silence stretched long and thin across the ruins of Telvara Prime. The Zaldar had stopped advancing. Their patrols, once brazen and methodical, had shrunk into small, jittery squads that moved erratically, scanning every rooftop, every shadow, every empty street as if expecting death to materialize at any moment. Their discipline was eroding. Their confidence was cracking. Captain Elias Carter watched them through his scope, his finger resting lightly against the trigger. The Zaldar were killers, but they were used to seeing their enemies. They relied on overpowering force, on open engagements where their superior technology rendered their opponents irrelevant. Now they faced ghosts, an enemy that struck without warning and vanished without a trace. It was beginning to break them. But Carter knew better than to underestimate an adaptive enemy. A static-laced whisper crackled in his earpiece. Movement. Eastern Quadrant. Something's changed. Sergeant Malik, perched in the skeletal remains of a collapsed bridge, had been tracking a Zaldar command group for the last hour. Carter adjusted his position, sweeping his scope over the designated sector. The Zaldar were no longer stumbling through the ruins, reacting blindly. They had tightened their formations, moving in coordinated patterns, their scanning technology sweeping methodically across the terrain. They had stopped being prey. They were hunting now. Carter's gut twisted in acknowledgement. They had been predictable in their desperation, but the Zaldar weren't just mindless brutes. They had learned. They had adjusted. Now, the game had shifted. "Cole," he murmured, switching channels. "Report." A moment of silence, then a soft reply. "South sector's quiet." "Too quiet." Carter's jaw tightened. That was never a good sign. Then Malik's voice returned, sharper now. "Captain, we've got trouble." Through his scope, Carter saw it. The shimmer in the air, barely perceptible, moving between the ruins with eerie grace. Cloaked units. Sniper hunters. The Zaldar had deployed counter-snipers. Carter exhaled slowly, adjusting his aim. This was no longer a battle of patience. This was a duel. He tapped his comms twice, the silent signal for retreat. Across the city, his marksmen melted away, repositioning before the enemy could pin them down. The Zaldar's cloaked units advanced cautiously, sweeping the battlefield with energy pulses meant to reveal movement. But humans didn't rely on movement alone. They relied on instinct. On knowing when to wait. And when to strike. Carter held his breath, tracking a faint distortion in the air. The Zaldar sniper was good. He moved carefully, using debris as cover, keeping himself unpredictable. But there was a flaw, a momentary pause as he recalibrated his cloaking field, a fraction of a second where his outline became distinct against the backdrop of ruin. It was all Carter needed. He fired. The bullet cut through the night, silent and final. The Zaldar sniper collapsed, his cloaking field flickering before failing entirely. The body twitched once, then stilled. The battle had begun anew. From their new positions, Carter's snipers engaged the enemy's specialists, a deadly game of patience and precision. The Zaldar's counter-snipers were advanced, their weapons guided by sophisticated AI, their armor tuned to absorb energy blasts. But they weren't fighting energy weapons. They weren't fighting algorithms. They were fighting humans. And humans fought dirty. Carter's team adjusted their approach, using reflections, false movements, decoys, anything to disrupt the enemy's predictive algorithms. The Zaldar, for all their adaptation, still relied on patterns. The humans refused to give them one. One by one, the enemy snipers fell. Some never saw the shot that killed them. Others realized too late that they had been baited, that the movement they had been tracking wasn't their true target. The Council had mocked human combat as primitive. They had failed to understand that simplicity was its own form of sophistication. Minutes stretched into hours. The city was no longer a battleground. It was a graveyard of unseen wars. The Zalthar who remained alive had abandoned the hunt. They were withdrawing. Malik's voice broke the silence. They're falling back. Carter kept his eye on the retreating figures below. Not in disarray, not in panic. This was a tactical withdrawal. They weren't running. They were preparing for something worse. He switched channels. Cole. Anything on the south sector? The response came, but it wasn't Cole. It was static. Carter's stomach clenched. Cole, respond. Nothing. A slow, creeping dread settled over him. The Zalthar weren't just adapting. They were leading them into a trap. The silence was different now. It was no longer the careful, calculated stillness of hunters waiting for the right moment to strike. It was heavier, unnatural, pressing in on Captain Elias Carter like a weight on his chest. He adjusted his earpiece again. Cole, respond. Only static answered him. Carter's fingers tightened around his rifle. Private Janessa Cole wasn't just a good sniper, she was one of the best. If she had gone dark, something had gone terribly wrong. He forced himself to exhale, steadying his pulse. He couldn't afford distraction. Not now. Sergeant Malik, he said, voice low. I need eyes on the south sector. There was no hesitation. On it. Carter shifted his position, scanning the ruins below. The Zalthar had withdrawn too easily. Their retreat had been orderly, too precise. They hadn't been beaten. They had been waiting for the moment to strike back. A flicker of movement. He stilled. Near the gutted remains of what had once been an administrative complex, figures moved in the dim light. Zalthar, clustered in a loose formation. Not searching. Not retreating. Escorting. Carter adjusted his scope. His stomach turned. Cole. She was on her knees, hands bound behind her back, her rifle gone. Her face was bloodied, her lips split, but she was alive. The Zalthar holding her weren't standard infantry. Their armor was heavier, layered with adaptive plating, their weapons bulkier, designed for close-quarters execution. They hadn't captured her by chance. This had been deliberate. A message. Carter's jaw tightened. The Zalthar hadn't understood snipers before. They had fought against overwhelming firepower, against brute force. But now, they had learned the true strength of human warfare. They had learned that a single hidden soldier could dismantle an entire battalion. And they had adapted. He switched frequencies. All teams, hold position. Malik's voice came through immediately. Sir, I have a shot. No, Carter said, his mind already calculating. Not yet. Cole wasn't being held out in the open for no reason. The Zalthar had chosen this location carefully. High walls, limited sight lines, cover that forced snipers into specific angles. A kill box. They were daring them to take the shot, waiting for the moment to pinpoint their locations and strike back. But Carter wasn't playing their game. He exhaled slowly. Malik, reposition to the north ridge. Sanderson, take the western overpass. I want overlapping fields of fire, but no one shoots until I say. Acknowledgments came through, quiet and precise. The team moved like ghosts, adjusting without a sound, without a trace. The Zalthar remained unaware. Cole knelt in the dirt, her breathing shallow but steady. She wasn't begging. She wasn't speaking. Just waiting. Carter's grip on his rifle tightened. She trusted him to get her out. A Zalthar officer stepped forward, taller than the others. His armor gleamed with the insignia of command. He studied Cole for a moment, then spoke in guttural, clicking tones. A translator drone hummed to life. The humans are weak alone. Carter remained still. The officer continued. Your skill is deception. A coward's weapon. You refuse to stand and fight. He reached down, gripping Cole by the hair, forcing her to look up. But now you are seen. Carter's pulse slowed. The Zaldar thought they understood. They thought snipers relied only on distance, on hiding in the dark. They thought that by exposing one, they had stripped away humanity's strength. They had no idea what was coming. Carter's voice was barely a whisper. Engage. The first shot came from the north. The Zaldar officer jerked back, a neat hole punched through his forehead before he even had time to react. Chaos erupted. Before the remaining soldiers could recover, a second shot rang out, then a third. The escort formation shattered as the Zaldar scrambled for cover that no longer existed. Carter didn't move. Not yet. He watched, tracked their patterns, anticipated their movements. Then, when the moment was right, he fired. The bullet tore through the air, striking the soldier guarding Cole's left side. The force sent the alien sprawling. Cole reacted instantly. She twisted, breaking free of her captor's grip, driving her elbow into his throat. He staggered back, and in the second he was off balance, she grabbed the sidearm from his holster. One shot. Then another. The last of her captors fell. She looked up, scanning the rooftops. Carter knew she couldn't see them, but she didn't need to. A small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude, and then she was moving, retrieving her rifle, disappearing into the ruins once more. The remaining Zaldar forces broke and ran. For the first time in this war, they knew fear. Carter lowered his rifle, his heartbeat steady. The Council had believed humans were clumsy, primitive, unworthy of standing among the galaxy's elite. Let them believe. Soon, they would understand.